She looked at him like he had wandered barefoot onto a stage meant for diamonds and silk. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't check the ticket properly. Her eyes carried only one thing from the start to the end: judgment. In front of her was a man in a black t-shirt, jeans, and plain sneakers that made him look more like ground staff than someone with a seat in first class. But the ticket in his hand said otherwise. It was valid seat 2A first class, real name, real money. The only thing that made it tear in half was the face of the man holding it. No one else in that first-class cabin knew that the quiet man sitting there held the power to rewrite the fate of the entire airline. No one knew he was more than just a passenger. He was a major shareholder, the CEO behind hundreds of flights a day that this crew was working for. But in the moment her eyes brushed past his face, none of that mattered. Only prejudice remained. A conclusion formed in a fraction of a second, and a decision carried out barehanded when she ripped the ticket and tossed it like it was garbage. She didn't see the calm in his eyes, didn't notice the quiet posture that many in negotiation rooms had once called the stillness of someone who controlled the game. To her, he was just a man of color in casual clothes sitting in the wrong seat. And like she had done before, she believed she had the right to remove him. No one stopped her. No one spoke up. Even the captain took her side, citing vague policies about compliance and flight safety, the same old veil used to cover actions rooted in something else. He didn't say much. He gently placed the torn ticket on the armrest, looked her straight in the eye, not angry, not shaken. The way he sat there made some people think he had given up, but the truth was the opposite. He was letting each second pass so the situation could reveal itself in full view, because he knew nothing speaks louder than a truth allowed to stand on its own. She thought he would step away like the others before him who had been pressured to move, but he stayed. No one came to defend him. He didn't need to shout for justice. He just stayed there silent and steady, like an invisible accusation. Then from a seat behind, a soft sound clicked, a phone recording. Then another and another. Eyes that had looked away now turned back. And in that moment, the power began to shift. Not everyone sees how prejudice works. It doesn't need to be spoken, doesn't need a name, doesn't need force. It only needs a doubtful glance, a half smile, a quick no that makes you feel like asking was already too much. That's what he had seen again and again. Back in his 20s, walking into interviews in clean shirts and polished words, only to be told one line, "You're not the image we're looking for." And that image never looked like his skin, never wore jeans, never stepped into first class without a Rolex or a tailored suit. But what she didn't see was that every rejection became fuel for each deal, each pitch, each investment. And now he sat on a plane partially owned by himself, not just to fly, but to see if the toxic culture they kept denying still lived here. And without knowing it, she became the evidence they never wanted found. What made this moment more than just a mistake was that it stripped bare a system used to deciding who deserves what with just a glance. The prejudice didn't start with her. It had been fed over the years by the silence of those who never spoke up. By the way, no one ever got called out for treating the unfamiliar with disrespect. But he didn't board this flight to get angry. He came to prove, not with words, with facts, with proof, with presence, just being exactly where he belonged. And right then, as the phone started recording, as passengers exchanged uneasy looks, as silence thickened into doubt, all eyes turned to him again. Not because he made a scene, but because he didn't walk away. Because he stayed in first class among those who had been raised to believe that only people like them belonged in those seats, and what bothered them wasn't that he didn't have a ticket. It was that he had everything but still chose not to show it off. His presence in that first-class cabin, simple, calm, unwavering, was the sharpest challenge to prejudice, and that was why they reacted the way they did. No one wants to believe they could be wrong, especially when the mistake is built into their idea of what is right. But today he didn't come to apologize. He came to show that dignity doesn't require a suit, that justice doesn't need to shout, and that sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to leave for an entire system to stop and look at itself. The ticket was torn, but his dignity remained untouched. Not because someone handed it back to him, but because he never allowed it to be taken in the first place. And when the flight attendant turned away from him, confident she had handled a situation involving someone who didn't fit the image, she didn't realize that very moment marked the end of her freedom to judge others based on skin color and a plain t-shirt. Behind his silence, a machine had already been set in motion, each gear turning steadily in the direction of justice. He didn't rise, didn't argue for his rights. He simply pulled out his phone and spoke into a brief call. No one knew who he was talking to. No one noticed how calm his voice sounded, so steady that it gave away nothing. But one thing was clear, it wasn't by chance that his phone was always ready to dial out with a single touch. In the world of those who have known what it means to be overlooked, preparation is the first armor of dignity. Behind him stood a wealthy couple holding early served wine glasses. Around their collars hung glimmering membership badges like silent declarations of priority, the kind of soft power that never needs to raise its voice. The flight attendant turned to them with a polished smile, swiftly sweeping the tension from earlier under the rug like it was a simple misunderstanding. But what she called a misunderstanding was in fact a chain of deliberate actions she didn't know were being recorded from multiple angles and by more ears than she imagined. Some began to record, others just watched. But the cabin air started to shift. Silence thickened heavier now. Those who had assumed this was none of their concern began to feel uneasy, not because of his presence, but because of how he was treated. What unsettles people most isn't always a loud injustice. It's when they see a quiet one that reminds them of the things they once ignored. The intern Mia stood nearby, eyes filled with conflict. She had seen the ticket scanned successfully. She knew he was right, but she was too new, too unsure to speak. Instead, she quietly opened a recording app and slipped her phone into her uniform pocket. Inside her was a war between what was right and the fear that stepping out of line would end her career before it even began. But she still recorded, because conscience is hardest to silence when the truth stares you in the face. He remained seated, hand resting lightly on the armrest, gaze steady, unwavering. His posture spoke without sound, saying that if anyone intended to remove him from the seat he had paid for, they would have to do it in full view of the entire cabin. That kind of stillness didn't carry violence or resistance. It was a form of silence that made others uneasy, a calm not born from fear, but from the knowledge of where real power lies. Whispers began to spread. Some passengers murmured about similar things they had seen at airports, in restaurants, in hotels, where clothing and skin tone weighed more than the truth. A middle-aged man leaned over to his companion and said softly, "I've seen this happen in Dallas. Different face, same playbook." A woman nodded, so it's not the first time. The atmosphere grew heavier. But the flight crew didn't back down. The captain was called again, this time with security. They repeated familiar reasons about safety, about rules, about following instructions, but when a passenger raised a phone and asked what rule lets you tear someone's ticket without even checking, there was no answer. The flight attendant said nothing. Her eyes started to flicker, but her voice held firm. She said, maybe it was a fake ticket. We've seen it happen before. She didn't realize that in saying that, she echoed a widely criticized incident from 2020 when a black passenger was removed just because he wasn't wearing a suit. When one person stands for the truth, it may be seen as a lone act. But when two, then three, and then the whole cabin begins to speak, it's no longer a voice, it's a warning bell. And that bell rang loud. A woman named Emma stood up and said clearly, this is discrimination. The person beside her turned and confirmed, I saw his ticket with my own eyes. Phones kept rolling. The first clip started to go online. Shares rippled beyond the plane, beyond the airport, into the web like dry wood catching flame. The flight attendant began to lose control. She grabbed the ticket again, shredded it into small pieces, and threw it on the seat with visible contempt. Still, he didn't move. She called for more support. A new voice came from the front. I'm a VIP passenger, and that seat was reassigned to me. She nodded in agreement, her face full of submission. But that submission wasn't to truth. It was to money and to prejudice. He pulled out a sleek black metal card, his name embossed in sharp raised letters. No one paid attention. She scoffed, anyone can print a card like that. Then glanced around, signaling security with her eyes. At that point, she truly believed she was doing the right thing. But what she didn't know was that every second of what happened was being recorded not just by phones, but by eyes that were opening wide in disbelief and growing anger. The flight was supposed to take off on time. Now it sat still, not because of a technical issue, but because of a standoff between truth and bias. And the man in the black shirt, the one deemed unfit for first class, stayed exactly where he was, as if standing up had never crossed his mind. Because he knew resistance doesn't always need shouting. Sometimes it just needs the courage to remain in silence, in light, and in the full truth unfolding for all to see. The silence in the cabin was no longer the usual calm. Before takeoff, it became a suffocating space where every breath carried an unanswered question. Everyone sensed something was wrong, but no one was certain enough to name it. The flight attendant who had torn his ticket still stood there, gripping her tablet, tightly glancing at him before turning away as if trying to erase the presence of someone she never believed belonged. She did not realize that her every move was being recorded not only by devices, but by the memories of dozens of witnesses, memories that would not be erased as easily as the name she had just quietly removed from the seating system. Mia stood in the dim corner near the crew rest area, her phone still recording from her shirt pocket. She had heard everything, the biting jokes, the whispered confirmations that what the flight attendant had done was not a mistake, but a deliberate act. She never imagined that her first day working solo would force her to choose between her career and the truth. But sometimes justice does not need a hero, only a witness brave enough not to look away. Up front, the wealthy couple had already taken seat 2A, as if they were its rightful owners. Champagne in hand, eyes drifting as though the whole incident was nothing more than a minor inconvenience that needed to be handled quickly so the flight could depart on time. They asked no questions, made no effort to verify, showed no concern for who actually held the rights to that seat. In their world, silence was always protected by status, and seating was not distributed by justice but by image and connection. A passenger named Emma stood up her phone, recording every second. She did not shout or confront. She simply said 3 words: "This is discrimination." The man beside her nodded, eyes fixed on the screen that showed an unfolding scene of injustice. At that moment, the conflict was no longer between a passenger and the crew, but between a man with the right to sit in his own seat and a system determined to protect prejudice at any cost. He still did not stand. Instead, he called Rachel, his assistant, who had been watching everything unfold from afar. His message was, "Brief, notify the board we are entering a critical situation." That line was not a threat, not a display of power. It was a quiet confirmation that tolerance had ended and the time for action had arrived. He knew this system well, every protocol, every corner, and he knew if justice would not show up here, he would bring it himself. The flight attendant began to falter. She returned to her console quickly, scrolling through the seat list, then intentionally deleted his name from the manifest. Brian, a young male attendant nearby, smirked. "Problem solved," he said, with smug satisfaction. What they did not know was that Mia had recorded the entire exchange, word for word, every detail, every piece of irrefutable evidence that manipulation was unfolding right there in first class, under the gaze of dozens of passengers, and soon millions of viewers. Marcus stayed still, not because he was powerless, but because he understood that once the truth was brought into the light, it did not need to shout to be convincing. The flight attendant returned no longer composed. She signaled security one last time, instructing him to vacate the seat or be removed. But before Linda, the security officer, could lay a hand on his shoulder, Mia stepped out from the shadows, phone in hand, eyes locked on the man being wronged. Her voice trembled but was clear. "I have a recording. I heard them say the ticket was valid, but they still plan to remove him. They erased his name from the system. I recorded everything." The cabin seemed to freeze for a moment. All eyes turned to Mia, the young trainee who had done what the entire crew remained silent on. A few other passengers stood up and shouted, "We stand with him." A man named Michael held up his phone for others to see the video had surpassed 1 million views in under 15 minutes. Emma firmly told the crew, "If you keep this up, you won't just lose this flight, you will lose your reputation." The noise in the cabin grew louder, not from chaos, but from growing unity. Those who had stayed silent now had reason to speak, and the man in the black shirt was no longer alone. He looked up at Linda and said quietly, but with weight, "If you touch me, the one you will answer to is not airport security, but the executive board I sit on." Linda stepped back, her face full of uncertainty. She could not tell if he was bluffing, but something in his voice made her believe he was not. Just then, Rachel confirmed from the other end, "The entire board has received the data, both audio and video. They are in an emergency session." A deep male voice followed through the phone. "I am James Thompson, member of Horizon's board. All actions of this flight crew are under review. Any further coercive action will be considered a serious violation." And in that instant, everything cracked open. The flight attendant went pale. Brian stepped back. Linda withdrew her hand from the radio. Captain Daniel stood frozen, his face drained of the authority he once held on this aircraft. They had finally realized power does not come from uniforms or tablets or policies. Real power comes from truth. And today, truth had found its way forward, not through a boardroom door, but through a phone recording every second. through the voice of someone brave enough to say no, through the quiet action of a young intern who refused to stand on the wrong side, and most of all, through the unwavering presence of a man who dared to remain in the seat he rightfully owned. Linda stood frozen in the first-class cabin like someone waking from a midday trance. Her hand was still near the radio strap, but no longer had the will to press the button. She had thought she was fulfilling a duty, enforcing procedures, maintaining order. But now, with the truth unfolding through audio recordings, disappointed stares and voices rising from passengers, her so-called duty had turned out to be part of a long chain of misjudgments she was too blind to see earlier. What had been brushed off as emotional reactions were now hard punctuation marks in a growing storm that threatened to wash away every carefully constructed lie. Marcus hadn't moved an inch. He remained seated in the very chair the entire system was trying to rip from him. But now his eyes didn't just observe, they reflected. They mirrored the core of those around him, showing them who they really were and why they were acting the way they did. Brian leaned against the panel, his grin gone, replaced by silence. Nicole, the one who had first torn up his ticket, tried to keep a stern expression, but her eyes wavered, flickering between confusion and dread. They had thought he was just another stubborn passenger. Now they were slowly realizing they had targeted the one man who could rewrite their entire professional fate in less than an hour. Emma kept filming not just to document the moment, but to remind them that the world was watching. She said loud enough for the whole cabin to hear nobody touches him now, and if you try, don't expect your career to survive past tonight. Beside her, Michael held up his screen with the growing number of live viewers. His voice was steady and low. Over 2 million people are watching this live. His words weren't just an update, they were an indictment. Whatever happened next wouldn't be seen as a routine airline matter, but a public confrontation with injustice. Nicole began stepping back, her breathing short eyes, scanning her crew for help, but finding only averted gazes. She understood that if she pushed any further, she would bear the full weight of the consequences. But in truth, the consequences had begun the moment she tore that ticket with no hesitation. Any chance to explain herself had been squandered in her mocking smile, her blame shifting, her erasing of a man's name from the system and calling it policy. What she failed to see was that those actions weren't just operational violations. They were ethical stains no uniform could hide. Marcus turned to Linda, his voice calm and deliberate. I suggest you stop now, because in a few minutes, the next person calling you won't be your supervisor. It'll be the one signing your termination papers. Linda didn't respond. She just stared at him, trying to gauge whether his words were a bluff. But what made her pull her hand back wasn't the words themselves. It was the shift in the cabin's eyes. They no longer saw her as the keeper of order. They saw her as a crack in a system breaking open, and she knew in that moment every decision she made could determine whether she sank or survived. On the other end of the call, Rachel continued feeding updates. The board of directors had convened in an emergency session. The legal team was reviewing past crew conduct. Internal systems were being audited. What was happening now wasn't just about flight protocol. It had become a case study for the entire airline industry, a mirror, reflecting how easily someone could be cast out just because they didn't fit the image a few frontline staff had imagined. A voice from the back spoke up. An older man. He said this had happened to his son 3 years ago on a different airline. No one had spoken up then. His words sliced through the tension like a final blow. A young woman nodded, said her brother had been bumped to economy despite holding a first-class ticket just because he wore a hoodie and carried a backpack. Scattered pieces now came together into a complete picture. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern, and the silence around it had been complicity. Rachel continued speaking into Marcus's earpiece. Everything is ready. James is requesting your official statement. Sarah is preparing the press release. David wants the crew involved off the plane immediately. Marcus stood unhurried. He walked calmly down the aisle, every pair of eyes following. He looked directly at Nicole, at Brian, at Daniel, then turned to the passengers. Thank you for not staying silent, for standing up when it would have been easier to look away. And to Mia, the intern who had never been given power but acted like a true leader, he smiled warmly and said, "You've just been promoted." The cabin filled with applause, not thunderous or noisy, but the quiet kind that meant something. It was recognition, not of rank, but of a turning tide. Nicole gasped, took a step forward like she had something to say. But Marcus didn't give her the chance. He tilted his head slightly and said, "You don't deserve forgiveness because you never once believed you were wrong." And to Daniel, the man who once held full authority on this flight, Marcus said one thing: you didn't fail because you lacked information. You failed because you chose the wrong side. No yelling, no forcing. He let them pack their own bags, walk themselves out of a system they once believed they controlled. And from that moment on, power no longer lived in uniforms or name tags. It lived in clarity, in the courage to face truth, and in the actions of those who believed dignity could never be measured by clothing or skin. There was no trace of satisfaction on Marcus's face after revealing his identity to the entire first-class cabin. No victorious smile, no triumphant gaze. Only the silence of a man who had ended a long stretch of silent endurance, using a kind of power he never wanted to wield in that way. He had no need to assert his worth because that worth had never depended on any title he carried, much less something to be bargained for in a seat dispute. But he knew sometimes to break a system built on injustice, it takes someone willing to endure to the very edge, then use their position to expose everything. Nicole slumped into the jump seat, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her lips, moving without sound. Brian leaned against the coffee station wall, arms limp at his sides, his face pale, like someone who had lost everything before even realizing what had happened. Daniel stood frozen at the end of the cabin, both hands on his waist, as if trying to salvage the last thread of dignity left in a uniform he had just stained with his silence. They were no longer crew, no longer representatives of the airline, but merely people whose actions had just been laid bare for what they were before an audience they never thought would see. No one forced them off the plane. No one needed to shout or push. They walked out of the cabin like shadows passing through the aisle, lined with standing passengers whose phones were still raised, their expressions no longer shocked, but quietly condemning. Every step they took was a reminder that a uniform does not cleanse a heart that has grown used to abusing authority. Linda came last. She wasn't ordered to leave, but she couldn't stay either, not as if nothing had happened. She stopped mid-aisle, her eyes locking with Marcus's. No pleading, no evasion. She didn't make excuses. She simply said, "I nearly made the biggest mistake of my career." Marcus didn't respond right away. He let a few seconds pass, as if testing whether her words came from remorse or survival instinct. Then he gave a slight nod, his voice low, but firm enough to carry the weight of both responsibility and grace. "I'm giving you a second chance. Don't mistake it for forgiveness. See it as responsibility paired with redemption. Mia stood nearby, still holding her phone, the recording screen still glowing. She was never a hero, not even brave from the start. But the choice she made in a single critical moment transformed her into something far more powerful than brave a conscience. When everyone else turned away, she stayed. When the truth was deleted from the system, she preserved it in a tiny recorder. And when the entire cabin spun in bias and pretense, she was the first to speak trembling but firm, with a heart that still knew the difference between right and wrong. Marcus looked at her with the gaze of someone who had placed his hopes in the next generation. He knew he couldn't stay forever to oversee every flight, but he could plant seeds for a different future. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, light enough not to draw attention, but firm enough for her to know her journey had just begun. Not through title, but through what she had just done. She would be trained to lead. She would be the first to reshape the protocols. And above all, she would be the one to remind her colleagues that a boarding pass is not just a right, but a contract between someone who believes in fairness and a system that promises to uphold it. A few passengers clapped softly at first, then more steadily. Not as celebration, but as an acknowledgement that something important had just been witnessed. Emma whispered, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that without getting angry." Michael nodded. "That's the calm of someone who doesn't need to prove anything." Another passenger approached a woman in an ivory sweater, her eyes slightly misty. She spoke quietly, but with resolve. "My son was once kicked off a flight for wearing a hoodie and carrying an old backpack. No one stood up for him. Today I saw what he should have received long ago." Marcus gave a slight bow, not like a hero, but like someone who had lived through that same pain and knew it never truly faded. The aircraft door remained closed, but no one complained. No one rushed. They sat quietly, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to witness the end of a chapter built on wrong. Their patience wasn't about getting to their destination, it was about justice. They refused to take off if the one who had been humiliated was still silenced. And they refused to fly if those who had used regulations to demean others still held power above the clouds. Rachel called Marcus again, reporting that the board had finished its emergency meeting. Immediate suspension notices had been issued to the crew involved. A full-scale internal investigation had begun. Appearance-based treatment policies would be erased from all evaluation systems. Passenger phone recordings would be accepted as evidence. Mia was temporarily appointed as internal ethics supervisor. Linda would be reassigned to the training center required to undergo mandatory re-education and complete a full ethics certification before returning to any flight. Marcus looked out the window. The sky was darkening. The terminal lights cast soft reflections onto the glass, showing his face like a quiet reminder that even if a ticket is torn, dignity can still be preserved if one is strong enough to stay in the seat they deserve. He hadn't come here to teach anyone a lesson, much less to flaunt power. He came to remind them that a human's presence should not be judged by their clothes or the watch they wear, but by truth, by a fully paid ticket, and by something so basic, yet so often forgotten, that everyone deserves respect, even if they don't look like the people you're used to seeing in first class. When the plane door opened again, it was not to welcome new passengers, but to see off 3 people who once wore uniforms like symbols of internal authority, now walking out under the silent eyes of a group that had seen enough to no longer pretend. No one stopped them, and no one asked them to stay. They walked out the same way they thought they had walked in, with the certainty that everything would eventually be forgotten. But this time, no amount of forgetting could bury what had just been exposed in midair. Nicole lowered her head, her eyes-red hands tightly gripping her bag strap. Brian followed behind, no longer with a smug look, only emptiness in his gaze. Daniel kept himself standing tall, trying to hold on to the last sense of discipline of a man who once commanded a cabin, but his face had lost its usual firmness, replaced by the confusion and hurt of someone who realized the power he once leaned on had completely crumbled. No one insulted them, no one asked them to apologize, because what they had just lost could not be measured by words, but by credibility, by opportunities, and by the chance to ever be trusted again. Linda still stood near the cockpit. She did not walk with the old crew, but she also did not dare step fully toward Marcus. She was stuck in between, and that was the hardest place to be, because it forced a person to face themselves. Marcus turned toward her, not to accuse, not to pressure. His gaze held no contempt, only something deeper expectation. Expectation that she would cross the line between passivity and accountability, not for forgiveness, but because she had to earn it. Outside, the new crew had arrived, led by a woman with the calmness of someone who had seen many crises before. She spoke very little, exchanged a quick word with Marcus, and nodded at Mia. No complaints, no sign of frustration over the delay, because they all knew some flights may depart late, but they carry real change, unlike those that leave on time, full of fake smiles and hidden prejudice. Mia was guided to her new place, no longer the intern hiding behind the curtain, but an official member of Horizon's new team. Her eyes still held disbelief, not out of fear, but because she still could not believe such a small act could create such a powerful wave. She walked with hesitant steps, but her gaze carried a new awareness of role, of responsibility, of a kind of power that came not from a name tag, but from making the right decision at the right moment. Marcus watched her, said nothing, but in his eyes was the rare look of someone who had grown used to disappointment but was finally satisfied. Down the hallway, a group of passengers still stood together, not leaving, even though the flight had been delayed more than 2 hours. No one complained. They stood as living witnesses to a moment they knew would not come again easily. Some walked up to Marcus, not to take photos, not to praise him. They came just to say thank you. Thank you for not choosing silence. Thank you for staying when many others had chosen to walk away. A middle-aged woman placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but steady. You did not make a scene, but you made something unforgettable. Rachel called again. Her voice was clear, like every detail had already been converted into action. The entire system was under review. The policy based on physical appearance had been immediately withdrawn. Every passenger present today would receive a refund and a formal apology from the board. Mia would be placed under the direct guidance of the head of diversity and equity. Linda had been reassigned to the training center, not fired, but would be strictly monitored throughout her recovery period. Marcus spoke briefly, make sure no one ever has to go through this again. Rachel replied, actions begin tomorrow morning. The airline has scheduled meetings with independent consultants, and media will be notified within 12 hours. But more importantly, passenger reactions are overwhelmingly positive. People are not angry about the incident, they are moved by how it was handled. No one expected a leader to be physically present facing the wrongdoing instead of hiding behind a comforting email. A young passenger walked up carrying a neatly folded boarding pass. He placed it into Marcus's hand and said, "I just want to say I was once removed from the priority lane because I was wearing sportswear. They never said why, but I knew. Today I saw someone do for others what I always wished someone would do for me." Marcus held the ticket gently, not as a keepsake, but as living proof that even the smallest wounds can echo loudly if left unhealed. On the screen, Flight 227 was ready for departure. No one rushed to board. They walked calmly with a strange sense of relief. They were not flying because of a schedule, but because they had just witnessed that justice was not a luxury. Inside the cabin, Mia checked every seatbelt. Her eyes met Marcus's in seat 2A. She did not speak, just a gentle nod. He returned it with a soft but powerful smile. His seat this time was untouched, unquestioned, respected. Because it was no longer just a number printed on a ticket, but a symbol of standing up at the right moment to protect dignity, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been seen as unworthy of sitting there. When the plane door closed again, the air inside was no longer filled with tension from a confrontation. It had settled into a calm silence like the sky after a storm. Those who remained had witnessed something they never expected on a regular flight. Not just an incident, but a revelation. And what lingered afterward was not anger, but awakening. Marcus sat quietly in seat 2A, a place that had once been denied, erased and taken by the eyes of prejudice, and the hands of those who believed they had the right to decide who belonged where. But now he had nothing left to prove. The ticket was not the proof. The title was not the shield. It was the steady silence under pressure that gave the most complete answer to a question society had avoided for far too long, whether we are truly fair when we see others or only fair when we know who they are. Mia walked past his seat, their eyes met. Neither spoke, but in that brief moment was a deep mutual understanding that needed no words. Marcus knew she was not just a brave young woman, but living proof of what he always believed. That justice does not come from status, but from choice. She had chosen the right thing, even though the cost of that choice could have been her entire future. And that very choice had shifted not only the outcome of the flight, but the mindset of a system that had grown too comfortable with compromise. Linda was still on the plane not because she had been allowed to stay, but because she had chosen not to leave. She stood near the cockpit, eyes cast down as if rethinking her entire career in aviation. Years of service, of learning safety, of memorizing procedures and control had never prepared her for anything like today. She once believed she was doing the right thing until the truth hit her like a wordless slap from a young woman and a man who never raised his voice yet silenced everything around him. Marcus walked gently toward her, drawing no attention, with no intention of humiliating anyone. He simply stood beside her, silent for a moment before he spoke low. And slow, sometimes doing the right thing does not come from following the procedure, but from knowing when to stop and look again at what we thought could never be wrong. Linda did not respond immediately. She swallowed hard, as if trying to swallow all the things she had ignored over the years, wearing that uniform without ever asking questions. Then she looked up, her eyes steady. "Thank you for not pushing me out with them. I need time, but I will not hide anymore." Marcus gave a slight nod. "You do not have to be perfect, just be real." In the back rows, Emma was checking the footage she had recorded. Not to upload more, but to keep for herself a record of something rare, that sometimes justice does not come from courts or policies, but from someone who stays seated amid chaos and does not step back. Michael leaned his head on the seat, staring out the window, his voice deep and hoarse that moment when he said his name. I have never heard an introduction so quiet, yet so thunderous. Emma smiled. That is the silence of someone who never needed to shout to be heard. The new captain stepped out to greet the passengers, a middle-aged man with calm poise and a soft, deliberate voice. He did not mention what had happened, nor did he apologize on anyone's behalf. He simply said, "Our flight will take off in a few minutes, and today we are not just taking you to your destination. We are also carrying a promise from the airline that every person on this plane is to be treated with equal respect." No one clapped, no one cheered. But in that silence was a quiet agreement that after everything, what they needed was fewer promises and more action. Rachel updated Marcus through his earpiece that the media team was preparing to release the news, not as an accident to be explained away, but as a moment to be remembered. Major outlets had begun reaching out, requesting comments from him, but Marcus gave only one response: let the actions speak first. He had not come here to become a symbol, nor did he want to be praised as a hero. He only wanted a seat to be respected like any other. And if he had to use his title to protect that equality, he would not to show off, but to correct what was wrong. The engines began to hum beneath the cabin. The overhead lights dimmed. Passengers settled into their seats, seatbelts clicked into place, magazine pages were smoothed out. A little girl across the aisle tugged on her mother's sleeve and asked softly, "Why are people filming so much Mommy?" The mother stroked her hair and replied gently, "Because they just witnessed something important that no one wants to forget." Marcus heard the words. His eyes turned toward the window. The runway lights reflected against the blurred glass, and he realized maybe all these years were not about becoming a boss, but for this moment to sit in the cabin like any other passenger and be seen as a human being, not judged by appearance. As the plane began to move, no one said a word. This silence was not out of fear or discomfort, but because they all understood they had just been part of something that life rarely lets you witness up close. Not because a CEO spoke up, but because an entire system was forced to look at itself when exposed under the light of cell phones and conscience. The plane lifted off the ground in an unusual silence, not because the cabin was too tired to speak, but because they had just gone through an experience that made every sound feel unnecessary. In that moment when the wheels left the runway, the weight that had lingered for hours seemed to fall behind, replaced by a quiet that was not entirely comfortable, but deep enough for people to reflect on things they thought were normal, but were in fact wrong. Marcus leaned his head against the seat, eyes gently closed but not asleep. He did not need to see anything more to confirm that the doubts he had carried for so long were no longer vague. All the data, all the reports, all the quiet feedback drifting through customer service over the past months had just been proven by that single moment when the ticket was torn apart by the way they spoke of him as if he were an impostor. And what troubled him most was not that it happened to him, but that it had happened to so many others in silence, in subtle rejection within a system too skilled at hiding itself. Mia walked past again, no longer timid like before, now carrying the posture of someone who had been through fire. She stopped beside Marcus's seat, bent slightly, and said softly, "I just got the official notice from the board. I will be sent for advanced training and return to lead courses on crisis response. I never thought it would lead here. Marcus opened his eyes, looked at her with a calm gaze. No one expects to be the one who changes a system, but change always starts with someone who dares not to turn away. In the back cabin, Linda was still sitting, saying nothing, holding an old notebook and writing something inside. Maybe a plan to start learning again, or maybe reminders of things not to repeat. Marcus had seen that look before in those who chose to make things right instead of denying them in those who understood that a fall is not the end if you have the courage to rise in a different direction. He did not expect Linda to become some new symbol. He only hoped she would not return to who she was before. Because this system had long been too comfortable creating neutral people, forgetting that neutrality in injustice is a form of compliance. Emma whispered to Michael they should put this into the new training policy. Michael nodded, but more importantly is how to make those who were not here understand the weight of every second we just lived through. Marcus heard that, and he knew the videos spreading online were not just viral clips. They were undeniable proof that a crack had been silently forming within the culture of service. A crack people only noticed when it shattered in front of them. Rachel added a new update. Media outlets had accessed Mia's recording and confirmed its authenticity through sound matching systems. Several national newspapers were reporting live, calling it a flashpoint in the growing backlash against appearance-based and unconscious bias in premium services. But what Marcus cared about most was not the headlines, but the reader comments. There, he read hundreds of stories from people who had been asked to leave first class, had their tickets questioned even after scanning, had their names mispronounced repeatedly with no apology. And when he read a comment from a man in Arizona saying, "I used to think I imagined that kind of treatment until I saw you holding your ground in that 2A seat," he knew this was no personal victory. Marcus sat upright and opened his laptop not to check contracts, but to draft the first version of a new policy. The first lines were not about systems, but about people. That every employee should not only be trained to follow procedure, but be reminded that behind every booking code is a real person with real stories and real memories that can be hurt. That discrimination does not always come in the form of obvious color. It can begin with a skeptical glance, a half smile, a deflected answer, or the way someone's name is spoken as if it did not deserve to be pronounced correctly. The flight entered smooth air. The lights in the cabin softened, the engines hummed steadily. A few passengers began to doze off, others opened books or gazed out the windows. But Marcus knew not everyone could sleep after something like that, because within each person something had been stirred. Maybe a memory, maybe regret, maybe a quiet hope that next time, if they are the witness, they will not look away. Mia quietly returned to the service area, placed her headphones on, and listened again to her recording. Not to boast, but to remind herself that truth must be preserved like a living form of data. So when someone says that could not have happened, she can offer it as a response that cannot be denied. Marcus looked at her once more and thought to himself, if the future of this airline lies in the hands of people like her, then maybe what he had done was not just a temporary act, but the beginning of something real. The layer of clouds stretched beneath them like a soft gray carpet covering all the unresolved matters left on the ground. Inside the cabin, the silence no longer carried tension, but a kind of stillness, as if everyone was processing the rest of it in their own heads. Marcus did not sleep, did not read, did not check his emails. He just sat there staring into the empty space in front of him where there was no screen, no paperwork, only the quiet of someone thinking about something bigger than words could capture. Mia poured another drink for a passenger near the back, her hands no longer trembling, her steps steady, her eyes no longer avoiding anyone. She was learning how to stand in the middle of gazes, not with fear, but with the awareness that her very presence had made a difference. The people who once looked at her as an intern now treated her as someone who carried weight, not because of any title, but because of what she dared to do when no one else would step forward. Linda still sat near the service area. She had not spoken since the flight began, but her expression had softened. At her feet was an open folder, its first page, titled Unconscious Bias Protocols. She read slowly, not because she did not understand, but because she was forcing herself to absorb, to remember not as a performance, but to never forget what it felt like to be exposed in front of a crowd. In that moment, Linda was no longer a senior flight attendant of Horizon Airlines. She was someone starting over, not with her years of service, but with honesty toward the flaws she had long kept hidden. Marcus opened his laptop again, typing with deliberate force into the new policy draft. He left no room for ambiguity. Every sentence carried intentional firmness. No more ignoring passengers just because they wore sneakers instead of leather shoes. No more unspoken permissions to question someone because they carried a backpack instead of a suitcase. No one would be allowed to pretend not to see when a colleague treated a customer with less respect because of their skin tone or hairstyle. What had once been dismissed as minor errors would now be clearly defined and dealt with without hesitation, because every tolerance breeds a silent mechanism of exclusion. An announcement came from the cockpit. The captain spoke of stable altitude, ideal weather conditions, and estimated landing time. His voice was calm, nothing remarkable, but it gave a sense of reassurance. Not the kind of safety that comes from being protected, but the kind that comes from knowing after so much disruption that things were returning to their proper course, at least within sight. Emma took out her phone again, this time not to record or post anything, but to type a message to a friend. She wrote that she had just witnessed a story she would never forget. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was painfully real. Michael quietly jotted down a few lines in his notebook, unclear whether it was a journal entry or notes, but each stroke was bold, slow, and careful, like someone who knew this story would need to be told again to someone else or to himself. Marcus could see the change in the eyes of the people around him. No one looked the same as they had when boarding the plane. No one held the mindset of being just a standard passenger anymore because they had gone through a moment that made all those standards feel paper thin. He understood some things only change when we are forced to face them, when there is no more room to avoid, no more reason to pretend we do not know. And this time it was his presence that made pretending impossible. The seatbelt sign lit up again. A female flight attendant walked slowly down the aisle, reminding passengers to prepare for landing. She paused for a moment by Marcus's seat, bowed her head gently, and said quietly, "Thank you for not walking away." Marcus looked at her. His eyes softened, not with the pride of someone who had just won, but with the calm of someone who knew that staying at the right moment can be braver than standing up. As the plane tilted and began its descent, everything seemed to slow down. The city below emerged faintly through the mist streetlights glowing along narrow roads. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed to order food. They were flying through a space where every loud sound seemed to be interrupted by a silent emotion, one that only arises when people realize they have just witnessed something that gently stitched their faith back together. Marcus closed his laptop, exhaled softly, his eyes no longer tense like at the beginning of the flight. He had no more need for defense, nothing left to prove. He had done what needed to be done at the right moment in the right way, not for personal glory, but for something that had been overlooked for far too long, that every person deserves to sit in the seat they chose and paid for, not because of titles, not because of skin color, but simply because they are human. The wheels touched down with a soft tremor that rippled through the cabin. No one clapped, no one cheered like they usually would. Instead, there was a heavy silence filled with awareness, as if everyone knew they had just been through something far beyond a regular flight. The aisle lights came on, and the captain's voice returned, thanking the passengers for flying with them, wishing them a good day. It was a familiar phrase, yet this time it carried a different weight, as if that wish was no longer just for a safe journey, but for a renewed state of mind as they stepped out that door. Marcus did not stand immediately when the plane stopped. He remained seated for a few more seconds, his gaze calmly taking in the cabin. Every detail seemed sharper than usual, from the seats to the ceiling lights, from the small round windows to the fingers of those gathering their belongings. There was a quiet reverence for the moment when people were forced to slow down and see the things they once took for granted, like the right to sit without suspicion, the right to be called by name without justification, the right to exist as a human being without proving their worth. Mia stood near the exit for the first time in her official role, leading passengers off the plane. Her eyes no longer held hesitation, but a quiet confidence of someone who had crossed the threshold of fear. When Marcus approached, she bowed slightly. "Do you need any assistance?" Marcus smiled. "No need. You are doing just fine." It was not a compliment, it was confirmation that she was not kept out of kindness, but because her true ability had revealed itself in the most demanding moment. Linda stood behind her, no longer pressed against the cabin wall, but stepping forward to face Marcus. She stopped, took a deep breath. "I know I was wrong. Not because I got caught, but because I did not see it from the beginning." Marcus did not react immediately. He looked at her, his eyes no longer sharp, but those of someone who had stumbled and understood the value of admission. Everyone makes mistakes, at least once. The real question is whether we stay silent the next time. Linda nodded slowly, then stepped aside to let him pass an unspoken apology that needed no extra words. Outside the door, a group of senior staff waited. They wore no name tags, no camera crews followed them. They stood still, eyes toward the aircraft, as if ready to face both consequence and change. Rachel stepped forward, nodded at Marcus, and the first thing she said was not sorry, but thank you. She said the entire system was being re-examined, hiring and training policies would be rewritten from scratch, not by some external consulting firm, but by those who had once been excluded like Mia, like the many passengers who had been subtly denied. Marcus did not ask for promises. He simply said, "If you do the right thing, I will not have to speak again. But if this happens once more, I will not only speak, I will stand at the center of every camera lens." Rachel responded with a slow nod, not one of submission, but one weighted by the understanding that a lesson had been learned that no database could erase. Not out of fear of losing customers, but of losing the very reason an airline exists, which is trust. A few passengers lingered near the exit. They did not rush off, but waited for Marcus as if waiting for a symbol to step out, not because of a title, but because he had represented what many quietly longed for, that injustice can be stopped on the spot if someone dares to not walk away. An older man gently patted Marcus on the shoulder, his voice warm and low. "Thank you for not letting us stay silent one more time." Marcus did not answer. He simply placed his hand on the man's shoulder, a silent promise between two strangers who had lived through the same cut born from prejudice. The sun had risen high by the time they left the terminal. Noon light streamed down on the bright white floor as if to wash away all the darkness left from the morning. But the light did not bother anyone this time. It came with a clear feeling that something had truly shifted. Not just the perception of a black passenger in first class, but the way an entire system was now forced to redefine what it means to be worthy. Marcus walked to the parking lot. No chauffeur, no reporters, no signs bearing his name. Just a jacket folded over his arm and a ticket tucked neatly in his pocket. He did not look back. He had no need to confirm anything with a glance because everything that needed to be said had already been proven up in the sky in front of the passengers and in the silence of those who once believed they had the right to decide someone's worth. He knew the recordings would keep spreading, articles would be rewritten, but what mattered most was not there. It was in the eyes of a little girl in the economy cabin who once asked her mother why everyone was filming and who might grow up with a different answer, that some moments are captured. So we remember someone once sat quietly in seat 2A and refused to leave. The story closed not with a grand finale, but with a deep, sharp pause, like a piece of music that needs no crescendo to leave the audience breathless. And it was that quiet which echoed the loudest. Because in a noisy world, sometimes what changes everything is the silence of a person who chose not to move.